Into the Healer's Garden, a historical fiction, Alabama, 1839. The summer heat hung heavy over Meadowland Plantation, 30 miles north of Mobile, Alabama. The cotton fields stretched toward the horizon like a sea of white when in bloom. But now, in late July, the green plants stood in neat rows under the merciless sun. Among these fields worked Martha, a woman of 43 years, who carried herself with quiet dignity despite the burden of enslavement. Martha was known among the enslaved community as someone with the knowledge. Her mother and grandmother before her had been healers in their West African homeland before being captured and brought to these shores. This wisdom had been passed down through whispers and demonstration, through the careful identification of plants and roots, through stories told in hushed voices after the day's work was done. The Bradford family owned Meadowland: William Bradford, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 young children, Thomas, age 8, Sarah, 6, and little James, barely 3. The Bradfords represented the wealthy planter class of the Deep South, their fortune built on cotton and the forced labor of nearly 100 enslaved people. Martha worked primarily in the main house as a cook and occasional midwife, a position that afforded her slightly more freedom of movement than those confined solely to field labor. Behind the kitchen, with the reluctant permission of Mrs. Bradford, Martha maintained a small garden of herbs and plants, some common, some brought originally from Africa, passed carefully from plantation to plantation through an underground network of knowledge. Those weeds, Mrs. Bradford called them when visitors came. Martha insists they help with the cooking, but even Eleanor Bradford knew their value went beyond flavoring stews. Twice, Martha had eased Eleanor's difficult childbirths with teas and poultices that the white doctor from Mobile, with all his formal education, had failed to provide. "You must remember, Esther," Martha said to the young woman beside her in the garden one evening, "this leaf soothes the fire of fever, but too much will cause deep sleep. Only 3 leaves steeped, no more." Esther, 19 and recently assigned to help in the kitchen, nodded solemnly. Martha had recognized something in Esther: a careful attention, a memory for details, and hands gentle enough for healing. Martha had begun teaching her as Martha's own grandmother had once taught her. "The master's people have their medicine books and colleges," Martha continued, her fingers working the soil around a small plant with delicate white flowers. "But our knowledge comes from listening to the plants themselves and remembering what those before us learned." Martha's garden contained plants familiar to white physicians: foxglove for the heart, willow bark for pain and fever, comfrey for wounds. But there were others they didn't recognize or chose to dismiss as superstition, plants brought from Africa or learned about from local indigenous peoples. Martha grew a particular root that, when prepared properly, could reduce the swelling of joints better than any treatment the plantation owner's doctor prescribed. The wisdom Martha carried was both medical and spiritual, though she was careful about showing the latter aspect to the white folks of Meadowland. Her grandmother had taught her that healing wasn't just about the plants themselves, but about understanding the person's spirit and the world's balance. These were concepts that the Bradford family's church would likely condemn, so Martha kept this knowledge close, sharing it only with those she trusted among her community. "This is blackberry root," Martha told Esther, digging carefully around a plant in the corner of the garden. "For the cough and chest troubles. We used this when Isaiah had the lung fever last winter." Esther nodded, remembering how the elderly man had been so ill the overseer had already spoken of replacement costs within his hearing. But Martha's treatment had gradually restored his breathing, and by spring Isaiah was back in the fields. The summer passed with its relentless heat and demanding work. Cotton bolls began to open, signaling the most difficult season, when all hands were required from dawn until dusk to harvest the crop that generated the Bradford wealth. Martha continued her double life, cooking in the big house, tending to her garden in stolen moments and using her knowledge to ease the suffering of those around her. August brought a different kind of suffering to Meadowland. Little James Bradford woke one morning with a high fever. By noon, 8-year-old Thomas complained of a severe headache and soon developed the same burning fever. By evening, Sarah too had fallen ill. Dr. Whitmore was summoned from Mobile. A grey-haired man with a severe expression and a black medical bag filled with lancets, purgatives and mercury compounds, he arrived the following day to find all 3 Bradford children delirious with fever. "Swamp miasma, most likely," he pronounced after examination, "or perhaps typhoid. We must reduce the fever immediately." Eleanor Bradford wrung her hands as the doctor prepared to bleed young Thomas, the most severely affected. Martha, bringing fresh water as requested, paused at the doorway of the children's room. "Begin with standard treatments," Dr. Whitmore instructed, "bleeding to reduce the inflammation, followed by calomel to purge the system. I'll leave additional mercury powders to be administered every 4 hours." Martha's face remained impassive, but inwardly she cringed. She had seen these treatments before and witnessed their devastating effects, particularly on small children. The bleeding weakened them, and the mercury, while sometimes effective against certain illnesses, often caused terrible mouth sores, lost teeth, and sometimes even death from the treatment itself. That night, after the doctor departed back to Mobile, promising to return in 2 days, Martha found Eleanor Bradford sitting alone in the hallway, outside the children's room, quietly weeping. The sounds of 3 suffering children came through the door, moans, delirious murmurings, and the restless movement of small bodies in pain. "Ma'am," Martha said softly, her eyes downcast as was expected, "I don't mean to speak out of turn." Eleanor looked up, her face tear-streaked and exhausted. "What is it, Martha?" Martha chose her words carefully. "I've seen this fever before. The bleeding and mercury. Sometimes they're too harsh for little ones." Eleanor stiffened slightly. "Dr. Whitmore is a learned man, Martha. He studied medicine in Philadelphia." "Yes, ma'am. I know he means well." Martha paused, then continued. "In the quarters, when the children get the fever like this, sometimes we use a tea. It brings the fever down gentle-like, without weakening them further." Under normal circumstances, Eleanor Bradford might have dismissed Martha's suggestion outright or even reprimanded her for questioning the doctor's methods. But these were not normal circumstances. She had already buried 2 infants in previous years, and the thought of losing all 3 of her remaining children in one cruel stroke was unbearable. "What kind of tea?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's made from the bark of a tree that grows by the creek. The people who were here before any of us, they showed my grandmother's grandmother. It tastes bitter, but with honey, the children take it. It brings down the fever without taking their strength." Eleanor looked toward the door of the sick room, where Thomas had begun to cry out in his delirium. "The doctor said the treatments need time to work," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Martha remained silent, knowing that saying more could be dangerous. Suggesting treatments was already overstepping her place in this household. Eleanor Bradford straightened her shoulders. "If they're no better by morning, Martha, I want to know more about this tea." By dawn, all 3 children were worse. Thomas had begun to convulse during the night. Sarah's fever burned so high that her hair was soaking with sweat, and little James lay too still, his breathing shallow. The calomel had caused violent purging that left the children even weaker. "Martha," Eleanor called, her voice cracking as the enslaved woman brought in breakfast she knew would not be eaten. "Tell me about the tea now." "It's willow bark, ma'am, but prepared a special way with other herbs to strengthen its working," Martha explained. "I have some ready." Eleanor hesitated only briefly. "William must not know we're going against the doctor's orders." "Not unless—" She didn't finish the sentence. "Not unless it works and saves my children's lives," was the unspoken conclusion. Martha brought the tea, brewed from a mixture of willow bark, known to white doctors, but rarely used in their treatments, and several other plants from her garden, including a particular root her grandmother had valued above all others for cooling the blood fire. The bitter brew was mixed with honey, and small amounts were carefully spooned into each child's mouth. "They need to take it every 2 hours," Martha instructed, showing Eleanor and the children's nurse how much to administer. "And cool cloths on their heads and wrists. No more mercury, ma'am, if you please. Their little bodies are fighting enough." Eleanor nodded, fear for her children overriding all other considerations. Throughout that day and the next, the children received Martha's tea instead of the doctor's mercury powders. The cloths were changed regularly, and by the evening of the second day, Thomas's fever had broken. He was weak but lucid for the first time in days. By the following morning, Sarah too showed improvement. James, the youngest and most vulnerable, took longer, but his fever finally began to subside. When Dr. Whitmore arrived as promised, he was astonished by the improvement. "The treatments worked better than anticipated," he declared, assuming his prescriptions had been followed. "Though the children are still weak, the crisis appears to have passed." William Bradford, who had been distraught over his children's illness, clasped the doctor's hand in gratitude. "You've saved them, Whitmore. I won't forget this." Martha, dusting in the corner of the room, kept her eyes lowered, her face betraying nothing. Later that day, Eleanor found Martha in the kitchen garden, harvesting late summer beans. For a long moment, the plantation mistress stood watching the enslaved healer work. "My children would have died without your knowledge," Eleanor finally said, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. Martha straightened slowly, her knees stiff from kneeling on the ground. "I'm glad they're recovering, Ma'am. What you did, this knowledge you have, it's valuable." Eleanor twisted her hands in her apron. "Doctor, Whitmore has taken all the credit, of course. That's as it should be, Ma'am. A slave woman can't be known to heal better than a doctor." Eleanor nodded, understanding the complexity of their situation. "Nevertheless, I won't forget this, Martha. I've spoken to Mr. Bradford about giving you more time for your garden. He's agreed, though he doesn't know exactly why. It was a small concession in the face of saved lives, but within the confines of their unequal relationship, it represented a rare acknowledgement of Martha's worth beyond her labor value. Word of the Bradford children's miraculous recovery spread among the plantation houses of the region. When the 8-year-old son of the neighboring Davidson plantation fell ill with similar symptoms, Eleanor Bradford quietly suggested to Mrs. Davidson that Martha might advise their own house servants on some supplementary treatments. This began a careful, unacknowledged practice whereby Martha's knowledge was sought by proxy during health crises that the formally trained doctors couldn't resolve. Martha never directly treated the White families herself. That would have been too great a breach of the social order, but her remedies were administered by white hands that took partial or complete credit for the results. Dr. Whitmore, meanwhile, had been intrigued by the unusually good outcomes of what he believed were his treatments for the Bradford children. Known for his scientific curiosity, if not his bedside manner, he began to ask more detailed questions about exactly how his prescriptions had been administered. Eleanor Bradford, torn between gratitude to Martha and loyalty to her own class, eventually revealed that she had supplemented the doctor's treatments with a simple willow bark tea used by the servants for fevers. Rather than being outraged, Dr. Whitmore was fascinated. Unlike many of his colleagues who dismissed all folk remedies as superstition, he had been corresponding with European physicians who were beginning to study the active properties of traditional medicines. "Willow bark, you say? The North American Indians use it as well. There's a physician in England experimenting with a substance derived from it." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "I would be interested to learn more about how it was prepared." Eleanor hesitated, then made a decision. Martha is the one who knows. She has a way with plants. Dr. Whitmore's scientific interest temporarily overrode his social conditioning. I should like to speak with her if I may. Purely for medical research, of course. And so, in an unusual meeting facilitated by Mrs. Bradford, Dr. Whitmore interviewed Martha about her knowledge of medicinal plants. Martha, cautious but seeing an opportunity, shared some of her knowledge, particularly about plants already familiar to European medicine. The timing of harvesting matters greatly, she explained, demonstrating how she cut willow bark, and the preparation. Too much heat destroys its power. Dr. Whitmore took notes, genuinely impressed despite himself. You've developed considerable skill through observation, he remarked, unable to fully compliment her intelligence directly. My grandmother taught me, sir, and her grandmother before her. Our people have been healing since before we were brought here. This comment made Dr. Whitmore uncomfortable, reminding him of the context of their unequal relationship, and he soon concluded the interview. However, in the following months, he began incorporating some of Martha's methods into his practice, particularly the willow bark preparation that had been so effective with the Bradford children. In his medical correspondence with colleagues in Philadelphia and London, he mentioned experimenting with native preparations of Salix alba, but never credited Martha or the generations of African and indigenous healers who had refined these treatments. By 1842, his paper on the efficacy of willow compounds in reduction of inflammatory fever was published in a Philadelphia medical journal, establishing his reputation as an innovative physician. For Martha, the aftermath of saving the Bradford children brought subtle changes to her daily existence. The additional time for her garden allowed her to cultivate more medicines and to teach Esther more thoroughly. Eleanor Bradford, though never acknowledging Martha as an equal, developed a complex respect for her that occasionally translated into small protections and privileges. You should write down your remedies, Eleanor suggested one day, several years later. For the benefit of the household. Martha looked up from the herbs she was drying. I don't write, ma'am. Eleanor frowned slightly, having momentarily forgotten this fact, or perhaps having chosen to forget it, as teaching enslaved people to read and write had become increasingly forbidden throughout the South. Perhaps you could tell me, and I could record them, Eleanor offered, surprising both herself and Martha with this suggestion. And so began another unusual arrangement. Over the following months, Eleanor Bradford transcribed some of Martha's medicinal knowledge into a small leather-bound book she titled Household Remedies. The entries were carefully worded to disguise their true source. For inflammatory fever, a decoction of willow bark prepared according to the method favored by country people has been found efficacious when traditional treatments proved insufficient. The book remained in the Bradford family for generations, eventually finding its way to a great-granddaughter who became one of Alabama's first female physicians in the early 1900s. She recognized the value of what the book contained and the likely true source of the knowledge. In a medical journal in 1919, she published an article that finally acknowledged the significant contribution of an enslaved healer known only as Martha to the medical practices of the antebellum South. For Martha herself, full recognition never came during her lifetime. She continued her quiet work of healing within the confines of her enslaved status until emancipation finally came with the end of the Civil War. By then, already in her 60s, she established a small practice among the freedmen's communities near Mobile, where both black and white patients sought her care. Her greatest legacy, however, was not in the medical journals that eventually acknowledged, though still minimized, her contribution, but in the people she taught. Esther carried Martha's knowledge forward, as did several others Martha trained in the years after the war. They, in turn, taught others, creating an unbroken line of healing knowledge that had survived the Middle Passage, slavery, and the particular medical challenges of the American South. The story of how Martha's remedy saved the Bradford children became something of a legend in certain medical circles, particularly among African American physicians who sought to reclaim the erased contributions of their ancestors to American medicine. In a fitting tribute, though one that came far too late, the University of Alabama Medical School Library in 1973 dedicated a special collection of works on folk medicine and early pharmacology to Martha of Meadowland and the countless unnamed healers whose knowledge formed the unacknowledged foundation of Southern medicine. A small garden outside the library grows many of the plants Martha once tended behind the Bradford kitchen, a living memorial to knowledge that survived against all odds, and the woman who preserved it through the darkest chapters of American history. The willow bark preparation that Martha had perfected was eventually recognized as containing the same active ingredient, salicin, that would later be synthesized as aspirin, one of the most important medications in modern pharmaceutical history. In the decades that followed Martha's death in 1882, her legacy lived on in ways both acknowledged and hidden. The Civil War and Reconstruction had transformed the South, but many of the racial hierarchies remained firmly in place, if in altered forms. The medical establishment, dominated by white men with formal education, continued to resist, fully acknowledging the contributions of women and people of color to healing traditions. Yet Martha's influence persisted through multiple channels. In the black communities around Mobile and across Alabama, healers trained in her traditions continued to serve people who often had little access to formal medical care. They combined her botanical knowledge with evolving understanding, creating a dynamic tradition rather than a static one. The Bradford family's fortunes, like many plantation owners, diminished considerably after the war. William Bradford died in 1867, still bitter about the loss of his property and social position. Eleanor, however, lived until 1889, and in her final years she broke with convention by speaking more openly about Martha's role in saving her children. "I believe in giving credit where it's due, even if others find it unseemly," she told her granddaughter Jane, who had expressed interest in pursuing medicine, a scandalous ambition for a woman of her background at that time. Martha knew more about healing than any physician I encountered, though she never had a day of formal schooling. Eleanor had preserved the Household Remedies book and passed it to Jane, along with stories about its true authorship. Jane Bradford, born in 1868, came of age in a South that was slowly, painfully changing. Against considerable family opposition, she eventually attended the Woman's Medical College of Pennsylvania in the 1890s, one of the few institutions that trained female physicians at that time. During her studies, Jane brought Martha's remedies to the attention of her professors, particularly Dr. Elizabeth Garrett, who specialized in pharmacology. Initially skeptical, Dr. Garrett was impressed when she analyzed the preparations and found them to be sophisticated combinations of active botanical compounds. "The proportions are precise," Dr. Garrett noted. "This wasn't developed through random experimentation, but represents generations of careful observation and refinement." Together, Dr. Garrett and Jane Bradford published a paper in 1898 titled Folk Medicine of the Southern Plantations, Analysis and Applications. Though revolutionary for its time in acknowledging enslaved people's contributions to medical knowledge, the paper still reflected the prejudices of its era, describing Martha's knowledge as intuitive rather than scientific, and emphasizing the role of the Bradford family in preserving the information. Meanwhile, in the black community of Africa Town, just north of Mobile, a settlement founded by formerly enslaved people who had arrived on the last known slave ship to reach the United States, Martha's direct medical lineage continued. Esther, who had been freed at the end of the war, settled there and established herself as a midwife and healer. By the 1870s, Esther had a small cabin where people came for treatment. Unlike Martha, who had been forced to practice in secret or through white intermediaries, Esther could openly serve as a healer, though she still faced significant obstacles from a medical establishment that was increasingly working to delegitimize irregular practitioners, particularly women and people of color. Martha always said our strength was in knowing both worlds, Esther told her apprentices. We use what works from their medicine and ours, and we keep learning. This pragmatic approach characterized the healing tradition Martha had passed down. It wasn't rooted in dogma or superstition, as white physicians often characterized it, but in careful observation and willingness to adapt. When commercial medicines became available that worked better than traditional remedies for certain conditions, Esther incorporated them. When new diseases appeared, she studied them and adapted her treatments. One of Esther's most notable contributions was during a yellow fever outbreak that devastated Mobile in 1878. While doctors debated theories of miasma and contagion, Esther organized a community response that emphasized practical measures, isolation of the sick, careful hydration, and herbal treatments to manage symptoms. Her methods couldn't cure yellow fever, no treatment at that time could, but her organized approach helped reduce suffering and secondary infections in Africatown. Dr. James Miller, a physician who had recently moved to Mobile from Philadelphia, took note of the significantly lower mortality rate in Esther's community compared to areas served only by conventional medicine. Initially intending to shut down what he considered dangerous quackery, he instead found himself impressed by her systematic approach. I expected to find superstition and chance, he later wrote in his journal. Instead, I found a woman with better observational skills than most of my medical school colleagues and treatments that, while I don't understand their mechanism, appear remarkably effective for certain conditions. Dr. Miller became an unlikely ally, one of several white physicians who began to take serious interest in traditional African-American healing practices in the late 19th century. While their interest was often extractive, seeking to identify useful compounds they could incorporate into their own practice without acknowledgement, it nonetheless helped preserve some of the knowledge that might otherwise have been lost as formal medicine increasingly pushed out traditional healers. By the early 1900s, the pharmaceutical industry was beginning to transform medicine. Companies systematically screened plants for active compounds that could be isolated, standardized, and patented. Many of these investigations targeted plants long used in folk medicine, including several in Martha's original garden. In 1917, Dr. William Haynes of the Smithsonian Institution began a project to document Negro folk medicine of the South before it vanished entirely before the advance of modern science. His research eventually led him to Africatown and to Ruth, Esther's granddaughter and the inheritor of Martha's medical tradition. Ruth, born in 1885, straddled multiple worlds. Educated at Tuskegee Institute, thanks to a scholarship, she combined formal nursing training with her grandmother's traditional knowledge. She maintained extensive botanical gardens and kept meticulous records of treatments and outcomes. A scientific approach to traditional medicine that impressed even skeptical outside observers. My grandmother's teacher, Martha, began this work when it had to be hidden, Ruth explained to Dr. Haynes. My grandmother, Esther, could practice more openly, but still faced much opposition. I'm continuing their work with the benefit of formal education, but the heart of our healing comes from knowledge that crossed the ocean from Africa and survived despite everything that was done to erase it. Dr. Haynes's resulting monograph, published in 1919, was one of the first academic works to take African American traditional medicine seriously on its own terms. Although still written from a white perspective and containing problematic language by modern standards, it nonetheless documented Martha's methods with unprecedented respect and detail. The publication coincided with the emergence of Jane Bradford's daughter, Eleanor Bradford Wells, as a physician in her own right. Named after her grandmother and raised on stories of Martha's healing, Eleanor had become fascinated with the intersection of traditional botanical medicine and modern pharmacology. As one of the few female physicians in Alabama and part of a prominent white family, Eleanor had access and credibility that Ruth, despite her superior knowledge of the subject, lacked. In a complex collaboration that reflected both genuine respect and the persistent inequalities of the Jim Crow era, Eleanor and Ruth worked together to document and analyze the medical tradition that had begun with Martha. Their work led to the 1923 publication of the Bradford Johnson Collection of Southern Medicinal Plants, a comprehensive catalogue of botanical preparations that acknowledged its dual heritage. The collection became an important reference for early ethnobotanists and pharmacologists, though the full significance of its origins remained underappreciated for decades. Throughout the 20th century, many of Martha's remedies were systematically studied, their active compounds identified